as the crow flies on the Vance Crow podcast.
Keaton Kruger, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for the opportunity, Vance. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm excited to be here.
You know, you're one of the people that has resulted as a part of the podcast. I don't believe we knew each other or knew each other very well until I started running this podcast, and now you've become like a constant fixture in my life.
The podcast is probably our primary connection point. I think, if I remember correctly, the initial connection point, I don't remember how I started following you, but it was a match made in Twitter, where you asked me a question about the way I eat because you were getting ready to go to a baking conference or something. But I don't remember how we initially connected.
I remember. That's right. Because you have been one of those people that's been a strong proponent of the keto diet. And I have actually been around nutritionists that have studied the keto diet, and they were very, very negative on people just jumping into it and doing it. Because just as a quick primer on keto, you are trying to take your body to getting so few carbohydrates that it gets into the phase where it's really efficient at burning protein and fat. And this diet was first discovered when people were figuring out how can we cure epilepsy without medicine. And so the dietitians are saying, hey, this is not something to be messed around with, but you, a guy I really respect, I like the way you were talking about it. You were out there talking positively about the keto diet. So I wanted to know what you knew about dieting that I didn't know.
I think that's it. And I don't know if you want to break into that right now, but my thoughts on that, it is more nuanced. And I'm guessing what probably sparked your interest is I started doing some longer term fasting, and I put a little bit of it out on social media. Well, not really much for putting stuff out on social media, at least, especially not at that time. And it created some, at that point, it seems more mainstream now, but I may be jaded by the people that I interact with, but it seemed like it was pretty mind blowing to people that I just decided not to eat for 3 days on a regular basis. The ketogenic thing, I have a lot of thoughts there. It's more nuanced than that because I don't eat a strict ketogenic diet, but it's a useful tool in my mind for a lot of people. But I also think a lot of people call it the ketogenic diet, and it's not actually ketogenic, but that doesn't mean it's not good and it's not helpful.
Yeah, I do remember the fasting part of it, because just a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, if anybody had ever told me you're going to fast for more than 24 hours, I would be like, you're trying to get me to join some kind of cult or what, what is this weirdness? But then I did it, and it's not something I like doing all the time, but I realized this fear I have of being hungry is a ridiculous fear. It's one that I have access to food all the time, and being in control of when I eat, not based on what my emotion is, made a huge difference to me.
Yeah, and primarily, if I'm an advocate of anything, it's probably fasting. That's been the most impactful thing I've started doing.
How did you get into it?
I tend not to be a person that looks back, so I'll piece together the best story I can get. I tend to be a believer in looking forward mostly all the time. I moved into a healthy lifestyle later on in life, mid-20s, through college. I yinned and yanged. I lost a lot of weight. As a kid, I was pretty heavy, and I lost a bunch of weight when I got a job in high school, and then put some of it back on in college like you would. And then there was a spark where somebody that I was spending a lot of time with got me started exercising, and it kind of just slowly evolved and evolved and evolved. And I can't really remember specifically how I got introduced to the concept of fasting. It probably had something to do with me being in search of health information in a way that allowed me to approach health, not from a fearful perspective, but from a proactive perspective. The way I became less fearful of getting sick was basically learning enough information that I kind of could do a risk assessment. So that's a long intro.
Were you afraid of getting sick?
I think so. I think I definitely had some hypochondriac tendencies. I have an anxious personality that's managed pretty well, I think, most times. Actually, it feels managed as well as it has ever, and it's been that way for a while. At some point, you wonder if you've lost that personality or if it's just something you're good at managing now. I don't know that answer. I don't know if I want to go back and test it. But so I don't remember.
I think that's the challenge with when you transcend certain parts of your life, the behaviors that you had, you're always looking back being like, did I actually transcend it? Do I have the habits and the thought patterns that allow me to not be worried about it? Or do I need to be on guard? Because, Satan's coming to get me and take me back to being bad at my habits. I think that's why running became so much more consistent for me, was that I realized like, hey, this did a lot of good in my life. And day in and day out, I never really know what that goodness is. But over the long term, as long as I keep this habit up, other things in my life go well. I
think sometimes it's good to let the armor crack. I'm actually in a point where with my diet where I let the armor crack a little bit just to see. So the circle all the way back to the fasting thing, it's happened at some point on some podcast somewhere. It probably has a lot to do with Peter Attia and his initial. He was on Tim Ferriss probably like 6 or 8 years ago for the first time. And then I started following him, and I've begun to follow him as well as Rhonda Patrick. And if you're in the podcast world, you've probably heard those two people. And I just dug deeper and deeper. And one day I just decided, like, this fasting thing seems to have some merit. What's the worst that could happen? I'm just not going to eat for 24 hours. So I did that. And it was probably at the same time when I was thinking about, if you're going to do something, do it 6 times at least, or do it enough times that you can't quit. You commit to so much. So I said, I'm going to do this for 6 weeks. I'm going to not eat for 1 day for 6 weeks, 1 day a week for 6 weeks, and see what happens. I don't know.
I'm a total believer in that, right? Like, I think like if you try something once, it doesn't work. You'll never know. Yep. Did I have a bad day? Did I have a good day? Whatever. But if you're like, hey, like the podcast for me, it started off by being like, I want to see what it takes to record 5 interviews.
I remember you saying that. I mean, I think that was one of the points where I connected with you. I was like, that's my approach, man. Like you committed to a certain amount to give it time.
Yeah. And like the reason is because you get about halfway in, or maybe even 3/4 of the way in, and you're like, all right, I kind of got this. I know what it is. I'm not going to finish it. And that's actually when most things fall off. Not even when it initially gets hard. When it initially gets hard, you're like, ooh, look, I can have my full attention on it. It's when you do master it and you start being like, well, can I let this armor crack because I know how to do it? What happens next?
And so to get to the land this fasting flame, I did the once a week, and that was pretty easy. And at the same time, I was getting some information about like intermittent fasting is what I used to call it. Now I call it time restricted eating because I think it's a more appropriate term. So I stopped eating breakfast and I started condensing my eating window. That's been pretty consistent for 4 or 5 years now, that my eating window is basically noon to 7. Sometimes 10 to 8. I mean, I want people to understand if they hear me talk about this. So like, I'm not the like Jocko Willink rigid person. Like it moves a little bit, but I restricted my eating window. Then the third wave I put in was, I decided to take it to the next level. So I started doing these 3 or 4 day fasts quarterly, and I had some good health benefits, or some good physiological outcomes there. I got a blood meter. I started taking my glucose and ketone levels, and I found that it takes a long time to get into ketosis. So I guess that's what, if I think about the ketogenic diet, a lot of people are eating a healthier low carb diet, but they're probably not ketogenic. If you actually take your blood and test it, it takes me 3 days to get to ketosis of not eating anything. I have other people that have done it that get there a little bit faster, but that's nothing to take away from the fact that for most people, reducing carbs, in my opinion, at some level is probably a good starting point to get yourself reset. Now, I will say at the end of my philosophy on diet as of now, in this point in my life, I've started to add in some fruits. We don't eat nearly as clean as we used to. I can tell when I eat stuff I'm not supposed to, and like it eventually builds up. But you don't have to be, I don't think you have to be as rigid, but I think sometimes you have to be that rigid to start out with to get yourself in the right mindset.
I agree completely, which is why I think when I was talking with a bunch of dietitians, I used to get really annoyed with them, because they would be sitting there saying, hey, diets don't work. You shouldn't be a restrictive diet. Those don't work. They don't last. And I think that they're missing a fundamental component of human psychology, which is you have to have a feeling of forward momentum, oftentimes by keeping yourself from something, in order to understand it, in order to get your balance and be like, all right, what happens if I lean into this thing and then I prepare my body to react in this way? Maybe then I can crack the armor, and I'm not constantly in that place where if I go over to a friend's house or I'm at a restaurant, I just have to make everybody bend over backwards. But like, you're trying to get to that place where you're saying, I am okay with the control I am exerting over myself, and I don't need to use all of my mental capacity to hang on to that control.
Yeah, I like that. Part of it, how's this feel to you? Like, I mean, part of it's like, I feel like you had to get to a point where you were proud enough of what you've done that or that you're proud enough of what you've done, you felt good enough about what you did, that you could sense when you were getting to a place you didn't want to be again. I think at some point you have to somehow get yourself to a point where you're happy or happy enough that you know what it's like to be there. And then if you start to fall off of that, you're better able to react. But if you never ever get to a point where you're like content or happy with whatever change you're trying to make, it's hard to know how good it feels. So like you sometimes don't know if you're missing. I don't know if that, I've never tried that before. This is brand new. But like,
yeah, I mean, I think that it's that you can't go half-assed onto the edge of chaos. And the edge of chaos is like, am I going far enough where I could fall down? You know, am I trying something that I'm not already comfortable with? And if you're like, hey, I don't ever want to fail, so I'm not going to make decisions about restrictions because I might not meet it or might not. That is not the way to get up on the edge. Now, I also am a big believer that you can't. Very, very few people in this world can have David Goggins level of self-sacrifice, constantly pushing yourself into this terrible dungeon, and have that not affect the rest of their life. Well, go ahead.
I don't know Mr. Goggins, but sometimes I say that guy's intense. That guy's crazy intense. And I think about like at some point, I wonder if he has like an addictive personality to the point where the addiction he has to have something, right? So his addiction is this intensity. Like some people just need the intensity and they don't feel comfortable without it. I find that I can have short bouts of intensity like that, but I can't force myself to live at that level of intensity. I think you have much more intensity than I do and the ability to live there. I can do like sprints of intensity, but I'm not as good at these long-term intense games, which is part of the reason why I'm probably a better generalist than I am a specialist, because I just don't have the intensity to drive all the way through.
Well, it's interesting.
Which I did sometimes.
As you're talking about that, like I remember when I first went to college, I didn't drink at all. I didn't drink in high school. Like I was around
Very
friends
similar.
that were cool
Very
and
similar.
drinking. But when I went to college, and I finally did start drinking about the second semester of my freshman year, I did that with the same level of intensity that I do everything else. So I went from being like basically a straight edge kid. I wasn't straight edge, but like, you know, not getting into trouble, and then all of a sudden partying all the time and really going all out. And I have to wonder if I don't see that in Goggins a little bit. Like if it's not like, hey, if he was going to be a partier, he would be the biggest, wildest, craziest partier in the world. And if he's going to be a marathon runner, he's going to be the best marathon runner in the whole world. And for me, life is just easier when I bring that level of intensity. But the problem is you can't stack that level of intensity on top of itself. So that's why you have to integrate it into your life and not rely on passion or excitement or enthusiasm.
Yeah. I would feel remiss if I didn't close this diet conversation. A lot of my friends, especially colleagues, know a lot about what I do. I think the key thing that I would say with that around fasting, just to close this out, is for me, knowing my personality, I wasn't going to hold well to those super strict restrictions, because I don't have that David Goggins like ability for self-sacrifice. But I do think that, you know, fasting's pretty simple. And I think that's something that, you know, I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on the internet, so this is not medical advice. But, you know, for me, it was simple. And for a lot of people, they're like, should I try it or not? And I'm like, well, like, it's not that hard. Just try not to eat for a day. And if you fail, like, you fail. But I mean, or a question I get a lot is like, how do I start fasting? I'm like, well, stop eating, I guess. I mean, it's not that hard. And it's a pretty low impact thing, but it has had huge outcomes. Like just the mental shift is so powerful. So.
Well, you're dealing with fear, right? Like everybody knows exactly what you're saying. They're saying like, but I might be hungry, you know, like I might actually have to suffer. And I remember for me thinking like, well, maybe I'll be mean to my wife, or maybe I'll be crabby at work, or maybe I'll, you know, you start thinking about all these things that you're holding together by feeding your caloric desires. And you're like, wait a second, maybe I should push on these limits here. Maybe I should be able to be hungry and not have it bleed from the inside into the outside world where it impacts other people. That might be a good skill to have.
The 3-day thing was terrifying. And I think that it's somewhat, like it feels primal, really. I mean, if you think about it, we probably weren't a species that evolved to be fed all the time. We're probably closer to that than we were 1,000 years ago, because we've been fed primarily all the time. But our species evolved not being in a constant fed state. So there's something to be learned or gained by going into a non-fed state. because I mean, part of the reason we got here today is a lot of people before us probably were able to better survive. And I mean, those of us that have ancestors were the ancestors that won, and a lot of those ancestors probably went through some times of pretty big feasts and pretty big famines. So at some point, to me, it feels a little bit like just connecting to a more primal version of myself.
Yeah, and I think that there's that primalness comes out when you find another person that has also fasted. And people mock the conversations about diet conversations, but the reason people have diet conversations is because we're thinking about food all the time. And if you're not eating, then if you're not actually eating, then your brain is being like, hey, should you eat? Hey, I'm going to grab your attention here. Maybe you should eat. And what I think most of us do before you ever try fasting or start putting yourself on restrictions is that you listen to that emotion, that instead of being bored or instead of focusing on something, you're like, oh, I feel something, maybe it's hunger. And until I got this sensation under control, I would say my life was distracted by hunger and I never even could name it. Hunger was an emotion that I didn't even have a word for.
Mine probably still is. I thought probably not too long ago, like, I wonder how much of my time I spend thinking about what I'm going to eat next. It's a lot. Like, just one day I started just like marking it down a little bit, and it's a lot. It's still a lot. I mean,
how much time do you spend preparing your food at this point?
We're in June of 2020, so we're post-COVID. We're June, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's post-COVID world. I don't even know what month we're in. So we spend a lot of time preparing. We have primarily for lunch, we have a smoothie that takes a little bit of time to prepare, but I would guess we spend 2 hours a day cooking and cleaning.
Oh, wow.
At least.
Wow. And is your breakfast, are you still on that time restricted?
So we don't eat breakfast. I mean, and the other thing is we have, the world doesn't know, but I have a wife and a couple kids. So, kids take time to clean up after and stuff like that. But I mean, we cook a lot.
Do your kids eat breakfast?
Yes. I thought about that. Like, what am I going to do? At some point, like, I just suspect they'll probably ask enough questions as to why mom and dad don't eat breakfast, and they do, that we can have a conversation about it. I think that, kids are they're much different physiologically, biologically than we are. So I think that they probably,
well, they're burning through calories.
Well,
way
and they're
more.
better
They don't have the fat
food.
storage. Yeah.
At least at the age of mine are like, they don't overeat. I have no ability to stop eating. If it's there, I'm going to eat it all. So, fasting is a way to work against that addiction probably, but they don't have that. Like our son, like if he's done eating, he's done eating. Sometimes he eats a lot. Sometimes he doesn't eat anything.
That's really interesting. I wonder if somewhere along our lines of training, we move from, hey, you should eat the way you feel versus, hey, you've got to eat now because now's the time we're going to eat. We're going to be
people that can do that. People that can just eat enough till they feel full is it's like a superpower that I have no ability to even comprehend how you would do that. Like I don't get it. I know people that do that, and like they're just like, I'm done eating, I'm full. Mind blowing to me. Like I'm like.
I haven't fasted in a while, but I remember realizing partway through that I was spending more time working because I didn't get up and go get something to drink or something to eat. And one of the things that I really felt like was really important was cutting out things that tasted sweet. So you can have like diet sodas and you can have, basically diet sodas are those waters that you can mix liquid into. And I realized when I drink those things, I am more hungry more often. I don't know the physiological reason.
Yeah, I would say that's probably true.
But the sweet taste always drives me to want more.
And there's different polymorphisms genetically that make you prefer sweet over salty. I actually just ran a report on our genetic tests yesterday for a different reason. And I saw a new line that was in there about like, do you prefer sweet over salty? And mine was like in the middle, but that was interesting because there are people that have like this clearly that the sugar addiction is one thing. Like you can get there where you prefer it, but there's also the salt side of the equation where I know people that like love super salty snacks. I'm like, yeah, they're all right, but I don't know how you eat a pound of them. So
genetic testing, how in the world did you get into looking at your family's own genetics and what that says for your taste preferences?
I feel like I'm above my pay grade here for sure. Just human curiosity. So I found out through Rhonda Patrick that you could get like an Ancestry or 23andMe kit. You could have your genetics test and you can download that raw data and you can upload it into at that point, there was a few places. One was called Prometheus. It's been since acquired, but at that point, it was like it was a nonprofit. It would give you all of your SNPs and everything that your genetic test told you, and everything, a single SNP associated with it. And it wasn't like, I don't know who the audience was. It was a little terrifying to do that also, because you don't know what you're going to find, right? But I did that once, and then I got through it. And then more recently, I think that Rhonda Patrick has as a supporter of her podcast, you can get access to her version of the genetic report, where basically she curates it. It find hers more useful. Like, it's much more useful to have hers, because basically it gives you the SNPs and what they mean, and also a little bit of interpretation. I mean, I'm sure she has some risk, and wants to be right on the edge of like, this is not medical recommendations, right? Because, you know, you can have 3 SNPs that say you have 3 SNPs that say you're at risk of some terrible outcome, and then you have 3 other SNPs that say the exact opposite, that you're better prepared to not have that outcome. So like, it's G by E, right? The way I use it personally is at least if I know what I mean, I think of it like a corn plant, frankly, because that's the world I grew up in. But like if I know at least what some of the downside risks are for this corn hybrid, I can be better about either putting it into places where it's not going to be, where those downside risks aren't going to be exposed, or 2, if I know what some of the downside risks of that corn hybrid are out at the beginning of the season, there's things I can probably do within the environment to better manage that downside risk. And I kind of think about myself the same way. Now that I have some idea of what some of the biggest downside risks are, what can I do now to help prevent those from expressing themselves later on?
Did you sequence your kids, and are you looking at their
No,
sequence?
we haven't. We have not. That's a whole different question. Like, fundamentally, like, do I need to know that? I mean, we did the tests that are recommended when they're kids, like, and when they're babies. We did all that testing but I mean, my wife and I both did it, but maybe they don't want to know. Like, I'm not a doctor. I don't know if there's great outcomes I mean,
yeah, so one of the
I just don't know. I don't know. I've thought about that. Like, I don't know how to decide if I would want to do that for them, or if I wanted them to make that own decision on their own when they're of ability.
One of the most interesting genetics conversations I ever had actually happened before I came to Monsanto. And I was talking with a guy named Jarrett Glasscock, who runs this interesting genetics company here in St. Louis. And he was actually one of the very first people to sequence human genomes as like a private company. And they sequenced Ozzy Osbourne. And so we were talking about that. He used to have a cardboard cutout of Ozzy Osbourne at his lab. Jarrett's a cool guy. So I'm talking to him and I'm like, oh, well, what did you find out when you got yours sequenced? And he was like, oh man, I would never get sequenced. And I was like, what? Like, you're the genetics guy. Why not? And he was like, well, I mean, you don't know what you're going to find in there. Yeah. And you might find that you've got a ticking time bomb that is, your heart's going to explode in 10 years. And we don't know that for certain, but it's a signal that tells us it might happen. And I was like, well, that way you could prevent it. You could do all these things. He's like, you should be doing that anyway. If what you do is you find this stuff out, now you've got that in the back of your head. Hey, I may die from this, or hey, my spouse may die from this. He's like, I think it's a Pandora's box. What do you say to that?
It is a Pandora's box. I remember having very similar emotions when we first did this. And I did it first. And, you know, for my personality, like I discussed earlier, like it's helpful for me to understand the downside risks. And maybe there's some changes that I've made, not maybe, I'm certain there's changes I've made in my life that are better for my health outcomes in response to that. We were fortunate. I don't think either of us found anything that was egregiously scary. The scary outcomes are outcomes that we likely could have assumed were going to be there anyway, just based on family history. So it's not like these are like, at some point, like, I think from my perspective, it was helpful to know, well, it's true, right? Like, the risk that you probably think you have, and you can do the things to manage against it. But in the absence of the information, it holds water. For some people, it may be terrifying. For me, it was really helpful once I got over the bridge and did it, because I could understand at least one. I was always feared of, anxiety is somewhat a fear of the unknown, right? So at least I know now, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that I could have thought were going to be big concerns that still could be big concerns, because the science isn't clear and it's always changing, but they're probably not as big a concern. So why spend time worrying about those. I don't know. I can understand what he's saying, but I think it feels short-sighted to me.
Well, I think there's a couple of weird directions we could go, and I'm interested to either one for you. One is I had a sibling, so I'm in the middle of 7. I had a sibling when they found out that I did not just one genetic test, I did 2. I did the Nat Geo one that shows you where your family came out of Africa. And then I did another one that was 23andMe to find out a lot more health cases. And this sibling expressed that they were pretty upset with me and my parents for having done it, because they were like, you're revealing to the world. If somebody wants to grab that, and she doesn't know very much about imputations, but she knows enough to know you can find out a whole lot about a sibling based on you and your parents. What do you think about protecting family members from having their genomes opened up?
It's a great question. I mean, it's the argument of can you put the genie back in the bottle? Like, at some point we have this technology, and it's there, and there's some clear risks. Like, I mean, there's potential security risks. I mean, if somebody has an information, especially a health provider or a health insurer, they could really change the way that they do insurance. And I think that and it's no different than like what's on your, you're on your phone. Like, I know all sorts of people know where I'm at all the time, but I don't want to know. I don't want them to know. I would prefer that they didn't. I work in a space where we think about digitally engaging customers using the technology that's there, but sometimes that stuff feels a bit uncomfortable. I guess the way I reason with it is it's really hard for us to put things back in the bottle, and our species doesn't have a great history of putting things back in the bottle. Sometimes we can control things that are dangerous to us as a species really well. But there's only a few cases where that's worked long term.
Like what?
They may not work.
Can you name one?
Like
maybe nuclear
weapons. Maybe. That's the first one that I thought of. Like, so far we've done a good job of containing that. That's a whole different thing. I mean, that part of that has to do with it's not widely available, right? Like, the people that have the ability to use nuclear weapons are a pretty small handful of people in the whole scheme of things. I think if a bunch of people had a bunch of nuclear weapons, we probably wouldn't have controlled it by now, because we've just been fortunate that the people that have been in control have been of sound enough mind that they haven't used them, right? But I think that in general, we don't do well at policing ourselves or at managing. It just seems illogical. Like, I don't know. I don't know how to get the thought through.
Well, when I think about the security implications of genetics, there was an experience I had not very long before coronavirus shut all the travel down. But I'm walking through an airport, and I've got loads of time because I think I was traveling from somewhere, and I way overestimated how much time I would need. So I'm there, and one of the salespeople for those like this little panel, and you can put your eye up to it, and you put your fingerprints on it. And they were like, "Hey, do you want to do this? This means you won't even have to go talk to another person. You just walk right through."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh, I love this. Tell me a little bit more about it." And they're like, "Oh, all you have to do is have your eye scanned and then your fingerprints, and then it's, then you can just go through." And I would love the convenience of it. I have no illusions that I am any less in peril of having my civil rights taken away by a security guard that's being paid minimum wage in the TSA line. But it felt really weird to be paying money to have somebody else have a scan of my eye. What are your thoughts on like the biometric screening and the value and the danger there? Have you seen those? Are you familiar with those?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. That my brain was going in probably in a parallel trajectory as you were starting that conversation about something else I was thinking was very relevant to this, and I'm trying to combine those two in my head. There's clearly risks on a personal level. Like, every piece of information you give up, you never get back. And I find it easy for me to think about those things and to maybe sometimes be anti-technology or things that take away my personal liberty or make me less able to be, make me more on the radar. But then I also think about, like, look at the way China's handling this COVID thing. Like, everybody, this is my version of the story, but everybody in China has WeChat, and everybody has WeChat. And basically they don't just use WeChat to communicate, they use it for everything. It's their personal like wallet. So everybody has a QR code. You scan that, and apparently it's pretty well integrated. I've not been to China, I don't know. And they're basically what they're doing is now they tie that to yourself. And if you were near somebody that has a COVID diagnosis, they label you as either red or yellow. So red has to do with the proximity you were at any time to that person that has a COVID diagnosis. And then yellow is, I don't remember how they break the break, but basically if you were by somebody that was red, that has been tested, you are now in the at-risk category. And if you scan your barcode, it won't let you on the train because you're in the second degree of separation, which is mind blowing. But here's the thing that I think it's easy for me to react that way. Here's a piece that's interesting that I thought about when I was mowing. I was on the lawnmower when I heard this conversation. That doesn't even seem odd to them. So at some point, like, I think everybody thinks they're so much more important to the world than they actually are, that a bunch of people could probably, find what we're doing, but are you high enough on the radar to even matter? I don't know. I don't know how to move through that, but it's interesting how like that's normal to them. It sounds like I have no reason to believe this person was lying. I don't have any way to prove that they're correct.
I hear about these people getting hired to be contact tracers. And to me, this is the most Orwellian thing that has ever happened in my lifetime. We are hiring, I believe it was like the last time I saw it was like 300,000 people. That's more than 250,000 people. There are cities that are not that large, that their entire job is going to be to doing this tracking of this disease. And I see no evidence. And in fact, I would even struggle if it were actually the Black Plague to say we should pay people to track other Americans based on what their habits are. It
makes me
seems
more
to me to be very, very uncomfortable.
Sorry, I was verbalizing what I was trying to think in my head. Sometimes I do that. Yeah, that actually makes me more uncomfortable than the China thing. Like, I think I'd rather have the technical solution to it so it doesn't mess it up.
Oh, right? I don't want either. I don't
want human error added into it. If I had to be forced to go through one of those baptisms, I think I'd rather be baptized by the technology than the humans managing it, because I know what humans will do. They'll mess it up and they'll use it for their own personal gain.
We're only going to be able to contain this. And I know we're an interconnected world. We're a globalized world. People travel internationally. You're going to have people in Beijing, Sao Paulo, and New York within the matter of a day. So I understand that you have to have some international level of connectivity and understanding about how this disease is moving. But it would appear to me that we are prepared to completely cover people's faces so they no longer are able to express their emotions. We're going to hire hundreds of thousands of people to track these other, where this disease is spreading. And we're willing to say that it is possible to spend literally unimaginable amounts of money. It is not possible for the human brain to comprehend $6 trillion. None of this makes sense to me, and I think it is only a dystopian future that it leads to. I don't think I'm normally a pessimist. I just think that the last few months have made me much more wary about these gigantic government interventions, these global government interventions. I don't want anything to do with it.
We've talked about this a lot. My reaction to that is that sounds very logical and feels uncomfortable and seems believable. And it doesn't feel great to me also. But I also always try to keep the lens in the back of my mind of, are we living history, or does it just feel like we're living history right now because we're in the middle of it, right? Like, have things been better or worse, and we just didn't have the ability to know it was that bad? I always try to think that way.
Well, I was jogging this morning, and my wife and I were, and I looked up and I saw this. There are these giant billboards around in St. Louis, and it's a very sophisticated, sleek woman standing just with her photo. And then right next to it, it says, harassed at work, #MeToo, jungle law, right? And so it is like a scary kind of like, if you've been harassed, jungle law will come in here. And so I was looking at that this morning and being like, man, it seems like a lifetime ago that Me Too was burning the world down, and that you were watching major media moguls and all these people go away. People aren't talking about Me Too at all. And so I have to wonder if maybe this is just the next chapter in the soap opera that we're in, and that this is really just this giant play that we're being entertained by while we go along with our regular lives.
There's a lot of people that are thinking like you're thinking also. So I have to hope that the species will continue to adapt and evolve, and the world is different and it's going to be different, but we've always been able to figure it out before up until now. I mean, at some point I suppose our species won't, but like so far we figured it out. So I think that
but
that's why I still have hope.
When you say figure it out, you're like people have meted out their conflict through violence, and that has always been the way. And what I look at right now is there is not very much violence going on right now. There's protesters and police, and they clash, but you're not watching the police pull out guns and just blow those people away. And you're not seeing protesters throw Molotov cocktails into crowds of people to kill them. But eventually, if you have one group that says we're going to take as much area as we can until somebody stops us, you will, if that unstoppable force is going to run into an immovable object, and one of them is going to be proven correct, because both cannot exist at the same time. And it appears to me that it doesn't look like everybody is prepared that that's the direction this goes in. Maybe everybody is, but I see more violence being added on. I don't know.
Some people are. I think about that. That's interesting. So at some point, maybe this is a good test for our ability as a group. I'm talking as a group of humans to figure out how far we've evolved, or how far we believe we've evolved in this direction. And we're in a very we've been in a very peaceful time. It's still, relatively speaking, very peaceful in the world. We know it can be unpeaceful, or there can be unrest. I wonder. I mean, I know a lot of good people my most important contacts are all over the board on what's going on in the world right now. So what I think is, like, there's something going on. It feels like history is moving faster than it was, but I'm not so pessimistic, I guess, yet to think that we won't figure out a way to have a more optimal outcome because of it. I don't have any idea what happens.
I think the thing that gets me about all of this, or the thing that's made me the most uncomfortable, comes from a concept called pace layering, where it was a concept pioneered by Stewart Brand, who basically was saying, look, the world operates as circles inside of each other, and the circle at the very base moves the slowest. And then just outside of that, it moves a little faster. The circle at the core is nature. Then outside of that, you have culture, then governance, then infrastructure, then commerce, then fashion, right? And on the fashion side, by the time you get to that outer ring, that circle is moving really, really fast. That is a gear that is going, and it's changing directions. It's going up and down. With coronavirus, we went all the way down beyond the government layer. We actually went into the cultural layer and started monkeying around with that. We started saying, we're going to cover up people's faces, and we're going to make it so you can't shake hands. You cannot come in contact with human beings. And to me, once you start messing around with that layer, the way that it spins, you have no idea how much impact it's going to throw into those layers that are above it. But I don't think it's a stable society. I think it is a very unstable society when you start messing around with layers deeper than fashion and commerce.
Do you feel like that's permanent? Like, do you feel like that will change at that layer is a permanent change, or is that a temporary change?
Well, I think there's probably been very few times in human history where we've gone 2 months where we're saying, do not come in contact with your neighbors. You know, I have a little niece, see her all the time. And then during coronavirus, we went about a month and a half where we didn't see her. And then when we finally did, she had been so conditioned to break the habit that this little joyful child has, which was to go up and hug everyone, which is to like cower and be afraid. Now, I think she's going to overcome that.
Her parents do a better job than we do then, because our boys can't, like, they haven't adapted. I'll tell you that much. It's hard with the kids.
And some parents are going to be way harsher on their enforcement of it than others. And same thing with teachers, and same thing with being at church, and same thing. Like, we're not talking about any one single handshake that people are missing. We're talking about thousands of handshakes and thousands of suspicious looks. And will I be in the same room as somebody breathing free air or not? These are much deeper than just 2-month questions or 2.5-month questions, because the residual components of them will remain. And we didn't come to these conclusions slowly and over time. We came there as fast as we possibly could get there.
I understand what you're saying. Here's where I'm at as I process this. I don't think 2 months is all that long. And I don't feel like I've structurally changed So the only experience I have is my N of one experience. What I think is going to happen, my outcome is like, I don't necessarily love the fact that I don't love it at all. Most people probably don't. What I think is my ability to assess risk has evolved personally. So now I believe that we'll probably go back to a point that felt a lot like what it used to feel like. But what I think is going to be different for me personally is I'll have a better level of appreciation for things that, at least for the short term, that didn't seem like something you should even be aware of. I mean, I can do my work completely virtually, but I find myself, and I used to really like that. I mean, that was one of the best benefits of what I did, is it was a virtual, I could do it virtually, but now I'm like, I really hope I can find a reason to make this not completely virtual forever, because I would like to interact with some people outside of this. So I think that's going to be my outcome, probably, assuming these eventually go back to normal. Is like, I'm going to yearn for them to go back to normal. So I'm going to try to make them feel more normal, but I'm probably going to have a better appreciation for things that I probably didn't even think about before.
I think the biggest change for me is I got to see, what do my friends, what do my neighbors, what do my community members, family, how do they react in crisis? And it was almost like we got a test run of like, all right, let's imagine asteroid's on its way, nuclear bomb is on its way. How are we going to respond? And you got to find out who's Johnny on the spot, like with good thinking ahead, who's somebody that is melting down with the panic and just wants it to stop, who's a person that's going to show up and be like, hey, I had some extra stuff and I wanted to give it to you. To me, while I think it could be a painful experience because you find out that some of the relationships you thought were going to be really important during a crisis aren't, it is damn good to know who is in your whale pod, who in your tribe is going to be sticking up their hand to be like, hey, listen, let's go this way. I've got some ideas. Because I think that was laid bare in this experience.
And I know you felt like you were a good intellectual like friend of mine. And I think you had the crisis hit you personally in your pod more than it hit my pod. So it was really good. And I think that's all, like, it was good for me to see that. It probably made me think about things in a different way. I think everything you said is true. I also think that personally, like, I'm going to be way better prepared if something else happens like this, or even not like this, than I would have been if this would not have happened. Because what it helped me realize is the line between, this is a Vance Crow thing for sure, the line between order and chaos is very thin. And
oh yeah,
I don't think at least my personal experience didn't fall into chaos, but I can see how close it can get and how quickly it can go to chaos if things would have changed just a little bit different. So I think that I'm going to be way better prepared to, one, prevent that from happening because I can do the things to ensure that it doesn't, and two, know that it could happen, and if it does, be prepared to adapt and prevail.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I heard the other day, somebody made an observation. Coronavirus showed us all, what do people want to do when they have time back to themselves, right? Like, it was no more a question of like, I mean, granted, if people wanted to be doing social things, they couldn't be doing those. But now all of a sudden you gave everybody back, let's just say an hour and a half in their day. Let's just cut out their average commute or whatever it was. Now you get to decide, if somebody is given an extra hour and a half of time, 90 minutes, what are they doing with that time? How are they progressing forward? That was a really interesting thing for me to observe as well. And in some ways I did not as well as I thought I would. And in other ways I was like, man, I can get myself into a routine when I have a lot of good time.
You can do that. You can do that. What else is on your mind today, Vance? Anything else?
Well, I'm looking over. You have quite a cool telepresence here. So I'm putting on a class tomorrow for a client who has hired me to say, hey, we have finally come to the realization that video is going to be the way we're going to connect with a lot of our customers long into the future. So we're going to invest in teaching our people, how do you set up a camera so that it looks good? What is lighting? How should you concern about sound? And I often say, focus on sound first and then worry about the way you look. And so I've been hyper focused on this because I've been building this class for about a month now. And now I'm looking at your set and I love what you've done here, man. I think you have a good thing going. How did you think through your spot here?
You're seeing option B. But I think I'll talk about so this spot here is my wife and I recently moved back to her family farm, built a house. And the house is mostly done, but we haven't really decorated it all that much. So the initial reason I chose this spot is it's the only piece that looks a little bit, it looks pretty well put together, and there's not like kids' toys everywhere. So I typically do it on our deck, which, because I move my hand that way, is that way. But the wind was too much and the sound wasn't good. So I think one thing that a lot of people, it's pretty simple to do. I don't do it all the time. I probably should do it more, but like just do a sound check beforehand. So that's nice because it kind of shows you like the fact that we live in this rural area is a big part of our identity, and it wasn't. We used to live in a metro area, and so that's an easy backdrop for us. But now internally, I'm not prepared. Actually, this is the only space I could find that I could get good lighting with some supplemental lighting. I've got something in the background that isn't just a white wall. So we've got the turntable and music, and like we kind of have this. We're in an ag industry. We're in a very conservative group, and my wife and I kind of have this love for music and this hippie is not the right word, but this little countercultural mindset. To most people wouldn't seem that way, but it's the world that we spend our time in. So you get some nods to that. It's just a good backdrop, I think. I'm looking forward to once I complete my actual personal office. I would not have done this initially, but now I'm actually going to finish the office with the intention of it being something that's good for virtual engagement. Not only from an audio perspective, but a video perspective also. And I don't know exactly how to do that. Vance and I were chatting a little bit before the call here about before we started talking and started recording, because I'm going to look to him for some expertise here. He's spent a lot more time thinking about this than I have, and he is in a course on it even. So,
well, it's so interesting. So I have been doing all of these podcasts, and most of the time the people that are willing to do a podcast are savvy enough to know how to hook up a webcam and do some of this stuff. But I have been on a couple of board calls and professional calls, and you see people that are clearly spending $1,000 on a suit or $500 on a suit, right? And in order to look good when they're in person, and then they go to get on these video calls, and they're setting their telephone in their cup holder in their car while they keep moving and working as though they were on a speakerphone. And you realize like people genuinely do not know how to make it better. And they really haven't even thought like there is both an art and a science. And if you learn these principles, it doesn't matter what space you're in, you can figure it out. But I've been very surprised. I thought people would naturally figure it out. And now I'm realizing, no, the reason that you figure it out is because you have an interest in how does light work or how does sound bounce around a room, those kinds of things.
I think about there's a lot of people that we've got these phones that have phenomenal cameras in them. And some people can take beautiful pictures with these phones, and some people take terrible pictures with these phones. And I fall on each side of the spectrum. I think at some point it's going to correlate directly with your understanding of just photography, and I have enough interest in that to have played with it to know I'm not great at it, but I kind of know the tenets of it. And I've worked between our love of live music, and I did spend a little time working for a DJ in a previous life in high school. You don't have to have a lot to have enough awareness to be good or better at it. I don't know if good's the right word, but I think a lot of people just don't even have the tools. They don't even have the tools to even understand that to some people it really matters, and to some other people it doesn't matter at all. So they definitely are going to pick up on it. Me and you might notice that stuff all the time.
The basics of it, like I think most people, what they think is the reason that I don't look good is because I haven't spent enough money. And one of the things that you learn really early on as you're trying to get better is 80% of looking and sounding good can be done with whatever you have around your house. Most of the time, the reason your photo doesn't look good is it either has too much light or not enough. And on video cameras, it's almost always not enough light. And once you start like getting those kind of principles in, and then you start saying, well, is it good to have light in front of me or to the side of me or above me, or how does all that work? You get a few principles down, and all of a sudden you can make yourself look like you're wearing $1,000 suit while you're wearing a t-shirt.
It's like if you're ever on a stage, if you've ever been on a stage and you understand how much how bright the uplighting is, like actually here, like there's lights just beaming at me. And if I looked that way, I'd have to have sunglasses on. They're not directly at my face, but like you don't understand how much uplighting it takes. But if you're ever on a stage when they're setting up a stage for a production and you get under the lights, you realize that it doesn't look like that as in the audience, but there's a huge, you get the contrast as an audience because you're usually dark and they're usually lit, but it's almost painful till your eyes adjust, at least for me. on a stage because of the uplighting. And I think that,
well, I think
but
that
for me, it's
like,
important. I think it's really important. I think there's more people like me and you than people realize. It's very distracting for me. If I go to anywhere, like the first thing I do, if we go to like the church we go to, they have a more contemporary service, or if I go to a concert, the first thing I'm doing is I'm looking at the audio setup, trying to figure out what they did and how they did it. And, you know, as they're producing the show, my wife always says, like, why are you looking at the sound guys? But I'm just trying to figure out what in the world they're doing, because these things that people don't even realize are going on are making the experience for you, and you don't even know it.
Oh, 100%. That's so I believe that people should quit thinking of it like, hey, I'm doing a video call, and they should instead say, I am full telepresence. I am creating an experience that when you look at your computer screen, you are coming into my space. And the experience of being in my space is more than just how do I look? How is the front of me lit? How is the back? Or what does my background look like? It's actually, what does it sound like to be in my telepresence space? Like, what is it? What is that whole holistic thing? And sound is one of those things that people way underestimate. You know, if the sound gets off between the visual and the audio, I think it's a little more than a 40th of a second. Your brain can fix that. As long as it's faster than that, your brain will sync those two things up.
I don't know if my brain can.
But if you get off by just a little bit, your brain can't sync it. And when the audio and the video are off, it like gives you like a headache because you just can't handle it. And I think that people really underestimate how much of their telepresence is impacted by how clear is their sound.
Everybody kind of has to be their own like mini live production manager, really, if you want to do this well. A good example of, this is just an example, but one example that I found really interesting that I think, you know, my wife, I shared it with her and she thought it was interesting, I believe, was, so we go to this church that has this contemporary service, and it's really well produced. They have really good producers that do the live music. And when you watch the video stream, they have a beautiful video stream. It's really high quality. They have a good audio stream. It doesn't drop, but you don't get the final production on top of the audio. So these people that are phenomenal artists, and they're phenomenal artists, period, but they don't sound nearly as good on the video, or they didn't initially. And I think they didn't have that last layer of processing. And my wife, as a vocalist, probably doesn't realize, because she only hears herself through the monitors, how much that changes it. Like that last level of production can go a long ways, and that can go, like, I think that can bring a performance from, you know, just a good singer to something that just, it makes you feel like you're completely in an experience. It goes from just watching somebody do performance to you being a part of the experience, and some of that's done with production. There's also some phenomenal artists that can just plow straight through that production value and not need it. But I don't.
The hardest part of putting the whole podcast together for me, by far, is cleaning up the sound. Because what I end up doing is record the video and the audio separate, and then I clean up the audio and I run it through some systems to make buzz go away, and to make sure that if your volume is different from my volume, that it can all be equalized. And then I sew it back to the video. And, you know, sometimes I try and get lazy and I'd be like, oh, I bet I can sneak this one past. Keaton had pretty good audio. Maybe I can. And when you know what you're listening for, all of a sudden you can't help but hear the mistakes. And that's why I'm always telling people, like, when the mistakes become clear, when you become aware of what's going on with sound, and people go out and they buy like a really good microphone because they're like, oh, the way that I'll increase my sound, the way that I'll get better is I'm going to go buy this $100 microphone. But what they don't realize is that microphone is actually more sensitive. So the problems that you had before are now hugely amplified because it's so much more simple, because it's so much more sophisticated. So I'm always telling people, like, focus on learning about sound. How does echo work before you ever go buy equipment?
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing I noticed in your podcast, I don't know if you've changed it, so I may be, but I noticed when you first started, just the total volume level on your podcast was lower than almost all other podcasts. So I, like, when I had my cheap earbuds in, I could never get, maybe I shouldn't give you it's not criticism, it's just a discussion on your podcast. But like, I would turn it up and I couldn't get the volume I needed to.
Oh,
And it seems like it's gone up. If you increase the total volume level of your podcast, or have I just stopped noticing it? But I do notice on some podcasts, the most well-produced ones typically have a higher level baseline audio than some of the other ones. And I think it's probably to compensate for like my little cheap earbuds. Because when I'm listening to podcasts, I'm not thinking about like, I don't need the best audio quality. I just need to hear the voice. I sometimes can't get it high enough. If I'm on like computer speakers or TV speakers, it's fine. But sometimes on those cheap earphones, it seems like you need to have a higher level of audio.
When I first started the podcast, I had a Blue Yeti, USB microphone that I'd had for a while. And I would try and just set that microphone in the center of the table, and I'd have me and the other person using the same microphone. And the challenge was, if I have a naturally loud voice, if they have a quieter voice, I had no way to fix that. I had to go through and fix it individually. So every single time somebody took a pause to speak, I would have to like mess around with the EQ. And when I started, I had a camera that would allow me to record in 4K, which is what I really wanted, but I didn't read the fine print. And the camera I bought would only stay on for 30 minutes. And so at the end of 30 minutes, I would have to lean over, restart the camera, and then keep the conversation going, which means that I would have to re-stitch the audio and the video together. So I had tons of time. I wasn't very busy. I didn't have very many clients. I didn't know what I was doing. But those experiences are what helped me understand, like, hey, if I have an echo in here, it's going to take me hours to fix it. So I better fix it before the echo ever gets in there. And that's the kind of learning that you get when you just start. And that's another big part about telepresence. You're not going to fix everything. You just fix one thing at a time and just keep getting better and better.
So there you go, Vance Crow podcast listener world. You know two things. One, you know that the amount of effort Vance puts into this is at the high level. And I think that's part of the reason everybody connects so well with it, because it is really well produced. And you don't even notice the fact that that's part of the reason that his podcast feels the way it is. And I think the other thing is I haven't taken the course, so I will not give the course. I don't know if the course is good or bad. It probably is good, but I think it's something people could think about, especially if we're going to work in this virtual world a little bit longer. And I am the first to say that when I'm in my normal 9 to 5, I don't always do it, but there are calls where I do try to do it. And, I think it's interesting. I know that you've talked a lot about VR, and I don't know if you're going to break into that today, but I've been thinking a lot about that. Like, what happens if, how does VR move into the world? And I read an interesting,
I'll tell you, I know exactly how it's going to be. The biggest thing that VR has that this system doesn't, that Zoom, Skype, WebEx, none of those things have, is sound proximity. And this is the thing that makes it so a comedian can't just do a live show, because normally what happens in a live show, and this has been since Greek, Roman, times, somebody would be down on the stage and they would project their voice out to other people, and they would have the center of it. So their voice was allowed to be louder than everyone else's. And if a person sitting next to him decided to turn and whisper to the person right next to them, the whole place couldn't hear it. But on a Zoom call, everyone's microphone is the same. Yeah. And so there's no way for you to whisper to another person. So it keeps you out of the frame of like, we're close and other people are far away. But when you put on the virtual reality headset, what happens when you go to a conference room or you're around other people is, if you're standing right next to them, you can hear them really clearly. And the further you walk away, the quieter and quieter that they are. And so you can have it where you can turn to a person that's right next to you, whisper, and only the people right next to you can hear it and other people can't. And that sound proximity is going to revolutionize the telepresence thing, because now you're going to be able to do the thing that you want to do, have side conversations while paying attention to a larger, more sophisticated group.
That's fascinating. That actually layers right on top of the thought that I had about this the other day, because Vance is a big proponent of this is going to change the world. And I've been trying to process, like, I don't have a lot of experience what this means. And I read an article that was about Epic Games, or the Epic company, I think is what the name of the company is. You know who this company is?
Yeah, isn't that who makes Grand Theft Auto?
They make Fortnite, yeah. So yeah, that was made Fortnite. But like the argument was how this company could potentially position themselves to revolutionize and to basically own the future of media and the future of our interactions. And it's a long article, but a few of the tenets, it's like 8 parts. It's more like a short novel, not novel, a short book. A few of the tenets that I didn't realize is one, they've created this game engine called Unreal Engine, which is one of the 2 like main game engines, I believe, to create games on. So like game companies don't typically build their own engines. The biggest ones do, but a lot of game developers don't. So they can build on this engine, and they have an interesting cost to access model, though it's very different than the others. But the thing that really made me blow my mind first was they showed how they can use VR in a layered approach. So the Star Wars movie, I'm not a Star Wars guy, but they had I think it's called The Mandalorian. Is that correct? It was like a mini series they put alongside Star Wars. And the way they filmed that was actually like full life VR. So they basically built these worlds using this high-end game engine with Epic. And then they built this giant dome in a warehouse, and the people would actually act out the movie or the scenes in this dome, but this dome is completely like all encompassing. So you walk into the dome and you are now in the world, and they interact as full humans, and there's no green screens. Like they're actually, this
exists. What you're describing exists right now. I have actually used this.
Yeah. So
that's in my basement, right? So you don't even need all you need is a large open space that you can make dark. And it doesn't have to be perfectly dark. So
how did you do it then? This doesn't seem like this is going to end at the same point, but I want to hear what you did because it may.
So in this video game that you play on your VR headset, you stand in a room and you take your pointer, which has a laser that you can only see when you have the VR headset on. Then you draw a circle on the floor, and then you step inside of that circle, and everything that's in there now becomes a part of your world. So if I want to walk over to a cabinet, as long as I have 10 feet to walk over to that cabinet, I can. Otherwise, I can use my joystick to move myself forward and backwards. Now, when you interact with the Star Wars characters, they are real life size because it compares you, how tall are you, to that other person. So when you first encounter Darth Vader, he comes up really close to you. You have to look up at him, and it gives you the sensation of being small. Yeah, go ahead.
This is a little different than that. That's probably the second point. The two main takeaways. The first one, to try to finish this out, it's even different than that. So basically what they would do is they had this giant dome, and they would project, I don't know how they projected it, the virtual world onto the dome, and then like you as a human would walk in with no gear on, and you would be interacting in this world. And they had the cameras set up in there also. Like the whole production. So basically what they did is they could bring in these completely different environments and record in the same studio. And they said it takes about an hour to switch the set. So basically they would move from, to take everything down and restart the whole system back up. They could move from like New Zealand to the other places. And these people, rather than having, the actors acting on a green screen and then them putting the world in behind it, they were actually acting it out, and they were recording the actors plus the virtual reality world around them. So they were actually recording the world as the actors were in it in VR, instead of recording the actors and adding the VR into it, which I was like, that seems like a shift. Because then they were talking about how they could layer the two. So you could use the typical post-processing or production they did on top of it, but they're actually recording it there. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing they talked about was Fortnite, and I don't know much about Fortnite. I'm not a big gamer. I used to be, and I gave that part of my life up. But they talked about these concerts that they're having in Fortnite that aren't actually really live concerts, but they feel live. So they've done 2 or 3 of these now. They've had millions of people attend these concerts with their friends in the game. So like, it's not actually live because they don't have the capacity to have 1 million people in the same environment at the same time, but it feels live because all the people that you interact with are in this, watching this person at this performer at the concert. And there's more to it. I don't want to take too much more time thinking about it. But as I dug through it, I'm like, oh my, like I can see how potentially some of this virtual world could begin to feel like a normal human interaction, because they're moving not only, I don't know how to put it. I don't. It's not a complete. Well, I mean, it's fascinating to me. That's all I've got.
I think that the way that this ends up impacting human beings is going to come at different speeds. So kids, like you're describing Fortnite, Like, they aren't even going to know what it was like to not have an avatar that represents you in some digital world and being able to bounce from entire universe to entirely different universe. And if you're coming to a class like the one I'm putting on, you're not going to be at the cutting edge. You're actually trying to keep up with these young people that are going to live and build in an entire world. And if you're not going to go play video games with kids, then you got to start putting these headphones. You've got to start doing them, because there are entire worlds. There are entire conversations in interactions with two people that have never met that, as far as I can tell, it feels damn real when you're in that VR headset. And people can be like, well, it's not real. Let me tell you why. And it's not da-da-da-da. But I'm telling you, the experience of being a human being is going to change because of this VR stuff. So anyway, I actually have to wrap up.
Before.
Yeah. Well, I got to wrap up. Because this has been a great conversation, but I just want to make the point that if people are interested, I think in late July, I was planning in mid-July, but late July, I'm going to hold a virtual reality conference. And I don't have a bunch of plans just yet. I'm just, whoever can get their hands on a VR headset, I'll try and figure out an experience that people can have over an hour or two. And we'll all just get there. We'll try it out and we'll experience it. I think you should try and get your hands on an Oculus VR headset, and we'll try and make that happen.
I will try to make it happen. I've thought a lot about that, and I think it's a good experience. I think my closing thought today will be that this conversation, it's uncomfortable, and there's been a few points where like it's uncomfortable because I can say I don't know, and I think you don't know either. I think the interesting thing about that VR piece to close out is like, if I reflect on, there's things that I had that were just default in my world that I'm sure my parents didn't have, and I think sometimes as you approach the scary side of the world's changing and it's falling out of control, try to reflect back and think about all the things that probably felt that way to the generation before you that just seemed normal to you, and you may be a little bit more optimistic that, we figured it out this long as a species. I'm still pretty pro the species, and I think we'll figure it out going forward.
Yeah, agreed. And that the world that we are imagining is absolutely not the world that will be there, because there's no way to predict how things will come.
Vance, I appreciate the opportunity. I've been a long-time listener, first-time caller. You are I see people all the time that see me interacting and say, I really like what he's doing. So thanks for what you're doing, and keep up and keep putting the effort in, because it's great.
Oh, man, I can tell you that you are an example for what I think a lot of people ought to do, which is you meet people out on Twitter, you ask them questions, you push on what they're saying, you're always respectful. And I find that our conversations can be like frustrating for me at first, because I'm like, no, I have this other point that I want to shove down your throat, but you push on me. And I think that that's the best part about these kind of long form podcasts, Twitter, having conversations with people in the virtual world. Like, let's have clashes. Let's get together and push on our ideas some more. If anybody is interested in signing up for that virtual reality conference, just go to my website, vancecrow.com, and a pop-up will be there. Just enter your website and I'll send you some information about it. So, Keaton, thank you so much for joining me. If people wanted to find you on Twitter, how would they do that?
I believe it's at Keaton.Kruger, but I should check that. What was it called? Put it in the show notes. I'm sure you will.
I'll throw it in the show notes.
I'm always looking for the way things are different than what I think they are. So I'm sure there's some interesting people out there that could engage with me. So that'd be
great.
Thanks for
brother. We will have you back on. We should have done this a long time ago.